Hi, my name is Julie Spencer-Rodgers, and I'm very pleased to be speaking with you today. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Ph.D. Martinez for the invitation and the University of Alicante. So I'm going to begin my presentation with an interesting puzzle regarding cultural differences in psychological and well-being and health. First, to talk a little bit about my area of specialization, cross-cultural psychology. What is cross-cultural psychology? It's a method that is quantitative in which we look at different variables, and it's an approach that historically developed as a way of challenging or trying to correct some of the assumptions that were made in North American Western psychology, primarily in the United States, where most of the research has been done. And there's an increasing focus now, instead of focusing entirely on studies done with American college students, but rather to be looking at indigenous psychologies in different countries. And there's a growing number of journals, such as the Asian Journal of Social Psychology, the Spanish Association of Social Psychology, and so on. So you're probably more familiar with the anthropological approach to studying culture, in which we examine one culture in depth. We look at these norms and values of a different culture in depth and document it with qualitative types of studies. In cross-cultural psychology, what we do is we study one variable, such as self-esteem, across different cultures. So, for example, comparing China, Japan, Spain, and so on. So my research begins with an interesting cross-cultural puzzle, which is group differences, national differences in self-reported self-esteem and psychological well-being. And in particular, we find that people in East Asian countries tend to report lower levels of happiness and well-being than people in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, or Latin countries, if you will. And what's interesting about these data is that it's not entirely explained by socioeconomic status or wealth. So, for example, a country like Japan, which is modern, industrialized, and wealthy, the people in Japan generally report lower levels of well-being than, for example, people in Chile or Argentina. And it's also not explained entirely by things like social freedom or rights, the political system of the country. So what can explain these differences? Well, psychologists have looked at a variety of different things. One is methodological factors. Maybe these differences can be explained by the way in which people in different cultures respond to questionnaires. And we know that there's things such as moderacy bias, where people tend to pick the middle of the scale. There's extremity bias, where some people in some cultures tend to pick the more extreme ends of the scale. These findings, as I mentioned earlier, are not generally explained by things like societal factors and socioeconomic conditions. There's even now some work where people are looking at genetics and the genetic basis of psychological disorders, depression, and so on. And there are known cultural differences in the prevalence of different genes in the population. And in particular, one gene, the 5-HTT-LPR gene, has been linked to depression, and this gene is more prevalent in East Asia relative to North America and other Western countries. However, it still doesn't account for the whole story. And so cultural psychologists are interested in looking at cultural differences and how people conceptualize themselves, how they think about their well-being, and basically how they even define the concept of happiness in different cultures. One area that I'm working on right now with researchers at the Autónoma University in Madrid is looking at cultural differences philosophies about how one should live one's life. And in particular, we're looking at a construct, disfrute de la vida, in Spain and also in other Latin American countries. And we're developing a research project right now where we'll be comparing this construct in China, Japan, Morocco, Spain, North America, Canada, the United States. And to give you a little bit of an idea of what these questions look like in this questionnaire, we have the actitud festiva, cualquier ocasión es buena para hacer una fiesta, the idea of carpe diem, that you have to take things slow and live for the day because you don't know what's going to happen the next day, the disfrute de la vida, or joie de vivre, es pasar el tiempo con los míos, es lo que más me llena. We are also looking at the relative importance of time and money in different cultures, and the idea of disfrute social, in which people like to spend time in social groups and talking and tertulia, sobremesa, and so on. So these, my collaborators are Dr. Raquel Rodriguez Carvajal and her research team at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Another area that I've been looking at for about the last 10 years is a construct known as dialectical thinking. And in particular, what I've been looking at is how dialectical thinking can explain the cultural differences in well-being in East Asian countries. And in particular, the lower reported self-esteem and happiness of people in China, Japan, and Korea. So what is dialectical thinking? Well, it's basically tolerance for contradiction, or the idea that the self is contradictory. It's composed of both good and bad qualities. Also, the notion that the self can change dramatically over time. And the Eastern view of contradiction is somewhat different than the Western view. In the Eastern view, the idea of tolerance of contradiction is best represented by the yin-yang symbol. So good is balanced by bad, white is balanced by black, happiness is balanced by sadness, and so on. In Western cultures, North America and Western Europe, the self is generally seen as more internally consistent and stable over time. And there's generally a preference for consistency. And in the Western view of contradiction, opposites are viewed as forces that are opposed to each other. For example, black is opposed to white, good is opposed to evil, and so on. So we wanted to look at whether or not this idea, East Asian idea of tolerance of contradiction, could explain cultural differences in self-reported well-being. And one thing that we looked at is just the extent to which people endorse contradictory statements. So on a self-esteem scale, you might be asked, how much do you like yourself? You might also be asked, how much do you dislike yourself? And what we find is very interesting. In North America and in Western Europe, people tend to respond with a very internally consistent way. So, for example, if they don't like themselves, they would answer 1. And if they dislike themselves, they would answer 9. And this would be a totally consistent response. In other countries, we find that people tend to be more moderate. So they might say that they like themselves somewhat, 5 on the scale, or they dislike themselves somewhat, so 5 on the scale. And then in East Asian countries, in China in particular, where I've conducted research at Beijing University, we find that participants tend to endorse both extremes of the scale. So they might say, yes, I dislike myself, and yes, I like myself. And so we can use these scores to compute an inconsistency index. And so if you look at across the board, you see that the responses amongst Chinese participants in Beijing and Asian Americans in California tend to score towards the middle of the scale, whereas European Americans, African Americans, and Latinos tend to have more extreme responses. And then if you look at overall, what does this mean in terms of how we compute a global self-esteem score? What we find is that overall, the Chinese participants look as though they dislike themselves more relative to European Americans because of the way that they respond to the questionnaires. One other thing we wanted to look at, well, is this simply a methodological bias in how people respond to scales, or is this really reflecting a deeper cultural idea of tolerance of contradiction? And another argument that people might make is that, well, perhaps the Chinese and Japanese participants are just less certain of how they feel about themselves. They're less certain about whether or not they like themselves or dislike themselves. And so what we did was we conducted another study. In this case, it was with Japanese participants at the University of Tokyo. And we recorded reaction time. We wanted to see how quickly people would respond to various questions about themselves. And in this study, we used ratings of extroversion and introversion. So how much do you think you're outgoing and talkative, and how much do you think you're shy and quiet? And so participants responded to different words presented on the computer screen, and we recorded how long it took them. And what we find, again, is that our Japanese participants exhibit greater internal inconsistency or contradiction in how they rate themselves. And what we find, however, is that this pattern holds across both a questionnaire task and a computer task. So it doesn't seem to be that they're just, not as sure of how they feel about themselves. It seems that they really are holding more contradictory beliefs about the self. We also wanted to get away from using just questionnaires where people are asked specific questions. There's something that's known as acquiescence bias, where people might just sort of agree with anything that you ask them. So, do you like yourself? Yes. Do you hate yourself? Yes, and so on. So we wanted to use an open-ended measure. And in this case, we used what's called the 20 statements test. And basically what this is an open-ended measure that asks a person to describe who are you? So the question is, who am I? And then they respond 20 times, openly. They can answer whatever they want to. And then we looked at participants' responses. And we had Chinese participants and we had American participants. And we coded people's responses on this open-ended measure. And we find that, for example, in East Asia, people tended to use more sort of within-statement contradictions. So, for example, they might say, I'm young, but I'm old at the same time. We also looked at the number of between-statement contradictions that people made. So, for example, on line 1 of the open-ended measure, they might say, I'm a stud, I'm really, handsome and cute. And then we find that by the time that they answer the 20th question, they have contradicted themselves. And they might say, I'm a nerd, I'm not very attractive. We also looked at what we call not self statements, and this is where people use a contradictory or opposite statement to describe who they are. So, for example, instead of saying I'm outgoing, they might say I'm not shy, or they might say I'm not from a wealthy family. I'm an ex-girlfriend, I'm an ex-smoker. And so the idea is that you're defining yourself by negating the opposite. Then we looked at how much people use change statements or dynamic statements to describe themselves. So, for example, a typical American response might be to say, I'm honest, or a dynamic, changeable response, typical of a Chinese student, might be, I'm someone who tries hard not to lie. Or instead of saying, I'm a volunteer, they might think about what they're planning to do in the future. So I'm thinking of volunteering, or I used to be a volunteer. And what we find is that in China, participants tend to use far more within statement and between statement contradictions. also far more not self statements and change statements than do Americans. So they describe themselves on completely open-ended measures where we haven't asked them specifically to respond to a question. They just said, go ahead and describe yourself any way you want. And they tend to describe themselves with more contradictory words and more changing and flowing and dynamic words to describe who they are. Then we also wanted to look at whether or not this construct of dialectical thinking can mediate or explain cultural differences in self-reported well-being. And so we developed a scale called the dialectical self scale. It's a 32-item measure, and it's designed to tap this notion of having dialectical views of the self. And then we conducted various mediational models using structural equation modeling to test our model. To give you an idea of what some of the questions look like in our questionnaire, for example, when I hear two sides of an argument, I often agree with both. When two of my friends disagree, I usually have a hard time deciding which of them is right. And there are always two sides to everything, depending on how you look at it. And then we tested the following model, in which we predicted that cultural differences in well-being would be mediated by dialectical thinking. And we also included another cultural variable, interdependent self-construals, to test an alternative hypothesis. And what we find, indeed, is that our measure of dialectical thinking mediates cultural differences in well-being. It's not full mediation, but it's partial mediation. So dialectical thinking appears to explain, in part, self-reported differences in self-reported well-being. And this has important implications for how psychologists measure and conceptualize well-being in different countries. If you use questions where you ask how much do you like yourself and how much do you dislike yourself, you can expect that East Asians are going to respond more highly on the negative items. We also wanted to know, however, is dialectical thinking truly associated with lower well-being and less happiness? Or is this really a cultural orientation that affects how people describe themselves and think about themselves? But does this really truly lead to differences in physiological well-being? And so now we're conducting research at Ph.D. University in Beijing and at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. We're going to be conducting this project. It's now in the works. We're going to be looking at whether or not East Asians report greater emotional ambivalence than do Americans. And what we mean by emotional ambivalence is the extent to which a person can feel good and bad at the same time. So I'm happy and I'm sad simultaneously. Generally speaking, in Western cultures, this leads to a feeling of emotional ambivalence and tension, psychological tension. People generally don't report not wanting to feel happy and sad at the same time. They usually try to regulate their emotions to feel one way or the other. And we also wanted to look at whether or not emotional ambivalence is less stressful for East Asians relative to Westerners. So in this planned study, we're going to have Chinese and American students give a speech in front of a group of people, and this will be evoking stress for the students. And then in a control group, we're going to have participants describe a neutral topic. And then in the experimental group, we're going to have participants evoke emotional ambivalence by talking about personal experiences in their past lives that were very ambivalent for them. So, for example, going away to school, if you're graduating from high school, you're going to be going away to college, you might be experiencing a lot of emotional ambivalence. On one hand, you're happy because you're excited to be living on your own for the first time, but you also might be sad because you're leaving your family behind and you may be leaving friends or a partner. And so these experiences were designed to evoke emotional ambivalence. And then we're going to measure various physiological indicators such as heart rate, blood pressure, and cardiac output. And then we create what's called a threat index. It's a composite score based on these different physiological measures. And as higher scores are generally related to threat or stress, and these have been linked to numerous health problems like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and so on. So you can see in this picture, this is a student who's been hooked up with the physiological equipment. This shows you how we measure EKG, or electrocardiogram. That's the heart rate. We also measure blood pressure. Blood pressure is just the force of blood against the artery walls. And we use a finger monitor in order to do this because it's less intrusive. So it's placed on the end of your two fingers. And then we also have, this is the blood pressure wave that we get when we record blood pressure from the finger. And we also look at impedance cardiography, and basically what we're looking at here is cardiac output, or how much blood is being pumped by the heart throughout the body. So we're looking at the volume of blood. And so the more stressed you are, your heart rate increases, the amount of blood being pumped in your body increases, and your blood pressure increases. Another indicator that we're looking at is the cortisol stress hormone. This hormone is produced by the adrenal gland. It does a bunch of things in your body. It increases blood sugar, it suppresses non-essential systems, and it's generally associated with the fight or flight response. And so when you're exposed to a stressor, cortisol is produced in the body. Cortisol is not necessarily a bad thing when you're responding to a stressful situation. It's good to have some cortisol. However, high levels or chronic activation of cortisol in the body can lead to a bunch of problems such as depression, anxiety. It's been high levels of cortisol have been linked to obesity, memory impairment, and so on. And the way that we collect cortisol is with saliva. We have participants put some saliva into a tube, and then it's frozen and it's assayed, and we look at the amount of cortisol that's produced in saliva during a stressor task. Our participants will be giving a speech, and this is an example of our very unfriendly committee that will be evaluating people's speeches. It's a very stressful situation. The participant has to speak in front of a video camera, and they're also told that they're being taped and recorded, and the interview committee takes notes while they're giving their speech. So it's a rather stressful situation. This gives you an example of what a typical cortisol response would look like in an experimental group relative to a control group. So cortisol increases over time. It reaches a peak about 20 minutes after the stressor has been induced, and then it sort of slowly tapers off. So what we're going to do in this study is we're going to have Chinese participants give a speech when they're sort of in an emotionally ambivalent situation, or when they've evoked emotional ambivalence, and then compare that to Americans in the same condition. And so what we expect is that for all participants, giving the speech should be stressful. However, it should be especially stressful when thinking about emotional ambivalence. And we also expect an interaction in which the experience should be less stressful for Chinese participants relative to American participants, presumably because they're more dialectical and they're more comfortable experiencing emotional ambivalence in general. So culture can explain differences in how people respond to various types of health and well-being questionnaires. So self-esteem questionnaires, life satisfaction questionnaires, and so on. And so as educators and psychologists and teachers, we have to think about the types of measures that we use when we're trying to measure such things as satisfaction with life and happiness and self-esteem. And we know that culture influences these things. However, we don't believe that in the case of East Asians that dialectical thinking is truly harmful for health. We believe that it's more of a cultural orientation, a way of conceptualizing one's well-being and oneself. And culture also influences other things about how people cope with various stressors, for example, prejudice and discrimination. So thank you very much. I'd like to just mention briefly some of my various collaborators in Beijing, in Japan, the United States, and as well as the various funding agencies that have helped to support this research. Thank you very much.